we're excited to be here on the last day of SOCAP. And this panel is to talk about the role of cities and why they really are the laboratory for change and social change. And so to do a little framing, and then we're going to get right into it and introduce the speakers. So we all know that in a few weeks we're going to have another election. And no matter who's elected, there's still going to largely be a stalemate in Washington and in many state capitals. And so despite the stalemate, the disparities between rich and poor, white and black, get worse, not better, and it's been kind of that way for almost the last 40 years. And there's a bright spot in the US that we all work in, which are cities that actually, most of them actually are able to get over that stalemate and actually get stuff done. And so what we were going to talk about this morning is that true? Why is that true? And what are some of the examples that give us hope for the future? So that's our discussion. And we have three people who are in the trenches on a daily basis who can actually talk about all the good things that are happening, who are here with us today. And I'll start all the way on my right. Ephraim Beister is the Director of Economic Development for Code for America. And next to him is Amanda Daflos, who is the Director of the City of Los Angeles Innovation Team for the mayor, working inside the government. And right next to me is Glenn Harris, who's the President of the Center for Social Inclusion. You'll hear more about what they do in a few minutes. But we thought we would just go over a few questions that we could all just get into a conversation and then engage you all in it as well. So the first thing really is, you guys, why do you think that cities and metropolitan areas really are the right unit of change for addressing our social ills across the country? Any order you want.
And you want us to jump in?
Just jump in.
I don't know if folks have been paying attention to what's happening nationally during the election, but that alone would strongly suggest that we probably have better opportunities to have a more meaningful conversation locally. In all seriousness, regardless of this election, I think we've spent the last couple of decades overemphasizing the national conversation. And especially when it comes to issues of social equity, racial equity, we're only going to get to the kind of outcomes we want to see if we're able to localize it. We actually literally have to rise, in my opinion, above the national noise, the national anxiety, to go local, to have meaningful conversations that allow us to engage not only in dialogue, but practical solutions. And I think the real opportunity is the sort of trans-local, sort of from locality to locality, getting to best practice, and then lifting those up. I think that's what's going to drive us to the possibility of seeing some different kinds of outcomes in our communities.
I would agree, and I think take a note from what you said, which is the practical part. I think in cities we have the chance to really do things that reflect our population, and knowing that the US population is changing nationally and then certainly in all of our localities. Almost feels like in LA that's happening on a weekly basis. And so we have the opportunity to really, in the case of LA, watch that and we've done a lot of work around data to really watch that and then try to be slightly more responsive. And even slightly more responsive is better than not responsive. And then formulate solutions with that practical idea in mind. And government doesn't move quickly a lot of the time, but when it can move more quickly at a local level, and it can move more quickly in response to our communities. And I think also talk back to our communities in ways that at a national level is just harder, because it's very complex to talk about things that matter we were just talking about Red Wing. In a rural community, those things are very different than what's going on in Los Angeles sometimes, but sometimes it's similar, but sometimes it's very, very different. So we can talk back locally to our communities. And also, although we have a ways to go in terms of quality of listening and actually hearing and reflecting those things in the policies we make and the projects that we deliver, we have a better chance of doing it innovatively and interestingly at the city level.
So ditto. I actually think, so Mike Bracken, who's the started the UK digital service, said something that sits on the wall at Code for America, which is the strategy is delivery. And the reason that I bring that up is government, local government, cities, those folks are closest to people. And they don't have a choice in a lot of these conversations to shut down government. You can't have a lot of the kind of polarization that happens. You know, I think, doesn't matter what color you vote or who you vote for, you got to fill a pothole. You got to do some of the nuts and bolts of government. It doesn't matter on those very polarizing issues where you stand. And I think that's one of the things where, at the end of the day, people working in local government, working in cities and regions, they have to work together. They don't have a choice to accomplish some of those major challenges facing their communities around infrastructure and jobs and inequality. I think there's also something really interesting about where Code for America sits. So for those of you who are wondering, we don't teach people to code. A lot of people think that. We actually help government redesign services using technology, agile software development, and user experience design. And if you imagine a circuit board, this is kind of what really excites me about the work at CFA. We spend a lot of effort getting policies passed. You can see those processes happen at the federal level. You can see that happen at the state level. You see it sometimes happen at the local level, where it's very divided, a lot of debate, and a lot of energy and money goes into getting people to vote one way or another. But we are not putting the same amount of energy into what actually happens, which is implementation. And so if you imagine the circuit board of all that energy that happens right when that vote is cast, and all right, and then we move on. Everyone moves on from that conversation of how does that policy actually go into action, and how do people's lives actually get better? And from our perspective, oftentimes, technology has been a piece of the reason why all of that energy sputters out by the time it gets to someone's interacting directly with that user. And so what we're seeing, I think to the point about government and local cities and regions being able to interact directly with users, is you're seeing a lot of energy. I think what Amanda's done with the business portal, which I'm sure you'll hear about, is a really good example of that, where cities and regions can actually internalize user needs in a really powerful way and design services and tools that actually meet those needs.
And so I think what's really interesting is, so you talk about code and the people who work with code kind of going in and helping the government get better and serve the customer better. But what's also interesting is Amanda and an emerging group of cities really around the country are essentially bringing innovation concepts from the private sector into the government and literally changing the culture. So you guys come in and help, but they're also trying to really change the permanent employees and the way that they work. I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about that and what you've seen in the time you've done that, Amanda.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And so maybe I'll start by just telling you what innovation teams are, and maybe the philosophies a little bit of how we're working and why we're doing the things that we're doing, and why in our case Bloomberg Philanthropies is so interested in seeing this happen. And so I think the short story is that Bloomberg Philanthropies has put what are called innovation teams, or better known as I-teams, around the country. And so I think now there's about 19 of them that are working, and actually 2 abroad in Israel. And so what we're tasked with is really having almost like a SWAT team model, I call it, where we're very focused on a problem. We're very focused on problem solving, and that in itself is actually slightly unique in government, to be thinking of things as problems that you solve across many departments, or across departments and public and residents. So our job is really to think about, in the case of Los Angeles, changing neighborhoods, or better known as gentrification, and how might we help have a better perspective on that, or at least an understanding of what is happening, and then be responsive. And so, as you can imagine, and as you all know, working and living wherever you are, this isn't a problem that's only impacting Los Angeles. So our job has really been focused on working with a lot of different departments and helping them understand how to think about government as problem solving, and also embed, I think to your point, some private sector thinking into the problem solving that we're doing and into the work that we're doing, and really helping government employees see their work differently. And I can tell a whole bunch of stories about how we've really seen seen this change. We've brought in design as a concept. We've brought in the idea of pivoting from, I sit at my desk and I process forms, or I sit at my desk and, process complaints, or whatever the case may be, to, well, actually, I'm helping keep people in their homes. And so if I move from thinking about helping people, process a claim on a rent stabilization ordinance complaint, to actually, if I do my job, I'm helping keep people in their homes. That pivot has actually been monumental for some of the staff that work in Los Angeles, because previously, sitting at your desk and just thinking about it as a piece of paper versus someone who sleeps in a bed at night and actually doesn't wind up homeless, that is a huge leap. And in the same ways, with some of the work we've done around business, actually bringing businesses into the dialogue about, well, what do you want to see happen? And let us not just be here in City Hall thinking about it by ourselves. Let us listen to you and actually design with you. And that's, I think, also been a chance, at least for us in LA, to pave the way for some departmental folks to think about things differently. And so we get calls now to come help redesign the layout in an office, because I think there's the connection between designing a portal and thinking about people as people who live in homes versus a piece of paper, to how we create the experience for folks who are interviewing, is actually all a move forward, right? Because there's lots of things in government that folks really do want to do differently, and having even just a small SWAT team there to help rethink is kind of a neat thing. So that's what innovation teams are doing around the globe, really, trying to, at least in small little ways, help move the way we think. And then actually, I think the other thing that makes it unique is deliver. We are relentlessly focused on delivery. We wake up every day thinking about problem solving and delivery, and being kind of like a quiet storm that you don't see coming, and then when it happens, you actually have something awesome at the end for residents and for folks in government. Like, that is our mantra every day, and that's slightly different in itself.
Yeah, so let me, Glenn, let me have you kind of close the circle on this before we talk about some specifics, which is, I think, the other thing that people will be surprised in, I believe, is that there are cities around the country who are actually addressing, in a very serious way, long-term racial inequities in those cities. And maybe you can talk about what you're seeing with that, and it's not external as much as it's actually internal. They're working from the inside out.
That's right. So have the great pleasure of, we have a project called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. It's a national project that's both a formal network. Right now there's 20 members, 20 cities and sort of local jurisdictions who are participating formally in a network that's, and most of them have been at this from anywhere to 5 to 10 years. And then we also have pathways. And one of the projects that we're really excited about is the work we're actually working on with Living Cities.
You had to say that.
I had to say that. But it's an amazing project. It's allowing us to, I think, formally really think about what this model is. Mm-hmm. And so we're working with 5 cities from across the country, to Ben's point, to really get real, not just about like what's a conversation about racial equity, but to the rest of the panelists' point, what does it mean to actually operationalize that? What does that mean to put it into practice? What does that mean for culture and institution change? And so at this point, we're working with about 100 jurisdictions across the country, working with 50 of them formally. We have about 25 jurisdictions that we're working with in California. And what that looks like is it's a cohort model where we're working together with those jurisdictions over the course of a year or 2 years to help them think about implementation. And I just want to name this because it's really important. One of the things prior to coming to the Center for Social Inclusion, I managed the City of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, which was the first kind of initiative of its kind. And to Ben's point, it really focused on institutional racism. What is government doing internally? And it had to address, the thing that's great about talking about racial equity is that you can't get to racial equity without good, effective government. Those two things you can't pull them apart. And so the major focus was not just what are our policy opportunities, although we looked at literally hundreds, but it was how do we give employees the tools to make change? We have, and I think this gets to the sort of frame of this conversation, we've come to think of government as elected officials, right. And government is not elected officials. 1 in 6 people in the country either work for government or are paid through government, right? We are government, writ large. And so the question is, how do we give people the power as they sit in their jobs at their desk, regardless of where they're at in the institution, and think about how they make change? And so we've really focused on giving people tools, being really clear about having plans. I'll give some of those examples later, but really thinking about how do we, again, put that into the sort of daily operations of our cities, of our communities.
And so why don't we go into some specific examples about what gives you optimism that the city metros are actually addressing our social ills, our inequities, our disparities. Let's give some examples. Let's start with you, if you don't mind, Glenn, about what actually have you seen change?
I talk about Seattle a lot, but there's great work going around the country, but I spent a decade plus working in Seattle. And to your point, I think the piece that, for me, that I get excited about is that I think we forget that transactional work, when focused, can actually lead to transformative change. And so in Seattle, this last year was really sort of a moment for me. We spent about a decade really looking at giving folks tools, people looking at policy and practice, and in particular, won't be any surprise to folks in the room, a lot of concern around the criminal justice system. And so made dozens of policy changes, especially looking at youth in the criminal justice system, everything from ban the box on criminal background checks to creating new programs that were really sort of wraparound services, focusing on jobs for young folks, literally dozens of policy changes. But this last year, the county, actually in King County in Seattle, decided that it was time to rebuild the Juvenile Justice Center. And I always love that word, juvenile justice. The kid jail is really what we're saying, right? And it needed to be rebuilt. It's old. They made a really good case, and they came out actually really strongly and said, not only are we going to rebuild it, we're going to cut down the number of beds. We're going to make sure there's job opportunities connected to it. Really thinking about skill building, good stuff broadly. But the community came back and said, we don't want another kid jail. And it's been an ongoing fight, but this last October, the city of Seattle's responsibility was to approve moving forward with the siting of the jail, right? And so community came to the city and said, we want you to do a racial impact analysis of this decision, which the city had been using the tool in its budget processes and policy practices for almost a decade. So they said yes. And so the city council asked for an analysis, and what came back, no one will be surprised about it, was we should really focus on economic opportunity. We should make sure that we're thinking about wraparound services, all good stuff. But the final recommendation was, well, maybe we should consider zero detention. Maybe we should consider that kids shouldn't go to jail. Maybe there should be another option. And last October, the city council in Seattle voted unanimously for zero detention. And I think that piece of us asking hard questions repeatedly creates the opportunity for us to get to some profoundly different questions, which is, what do we want to do with our youth? What is our goal in trying to make sure that we're both achieving public safety, but actually creating opportunity for young folks? No one came out with a suggestion about what something else might look like, but I think folks were begging a fundamentally different series of questions.
Interesting. What gives you optimism, Amanda?
So I think, for me, a lot of things actually give me a great deal of optimism about cities. And I think the first is just the recognition that cities are a place where a lot of people are moving right now. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows the numbers, but at this point, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of the world's population for the first time live in cities. And that is a call to action. And I think not only is that number increasing, but the recognition of the fact that that's a fact is also increasing. Of course, what it means for our rural communities is a whole separate question. But I think as far as cities go, solving these problems, it's no longer actually an option, it is required. And so that paired with the fact that I can speak for LA, which is that more than 40% of our workforce is due to retire by 2018. That's not a new number. I'm sure if you work in cities, that number's been sort of hanging out for about 15 years. But the recession certainly preserved some folks and helped them stay in the workforce. And I think we believe that unless something drastic happens, which probably lots of folks here at this conference would agree that maybe that's possible in the next 24 months. But one way or another, we know that a lot of people will retire. What that means to me is that there's also an opportunity for folks like the folks that work with me, folks like everybody here, folks like folks in this room, to actually join government. And so I've become sort of a nerd in LA because I say government is actually really cool. And we don't highlight that, right? We don't say that in government, and we no longer do a great job of saying you should come work here because it's actually amazing. And filling a pothole isn't just filling a pothole. Processing a form isn't processing a form. It's keeping people in their homes, and it's making it a great place to live. And so I think that amount of opportunity that we have in cities is never ending, actually. And I agree that there's certainly the political side of the house, but where the work actually gets done in departments and on the front lines is really where there is just so much opportunity. And the opportunity paired with the new opportunities of having great, fabulous people come into government is just a huge thing that we're going to see happen in this country. And if we don't do it well, of course, that means a whole bunch of not so great things for us. So I hope all of you go home and apply for jobs in cities. We're hiring in LA, so that's a great news. So if you want to come down and apply, let me know. But I just think that there are also so many problems that we have, and while this first set of things I said gives me optimism, I think what really scares me is that homelessness is on the rise all around, at least in the West Coast. In Los Angeles, we've seen more than a 12% rise in the last year. That is huge. And we really need amazing people to come help us solve those challenges. And we need new ways of thinking. And what I think is pretty amazing to me is that we're actually, at least in the departments, and in certain cities, I think we're really aware of that. And that recognition is huge because they always say, I forget exactly how it goes, but like admitting you have a problem is the first part of the first stage,
recovery,
right?
or something like that.
So we're like getting there.
Yeah.
So we need great people to help us now solve those problems.
Yep. Makes sense.
There's so many places I can build on that. One, we work with bureaucrats, the great defenders of democracy, all the time, and I will say that they give me hope and optimism. We work with amazing people who care about making the people who they work with and serve, making their lives better. And I think that gives me great excitement that government's really doing great work. And you have great teams like I-teams across the country, but you have cities just hiring differently and trying to bring new people into government, young people into government, technologists into government. The city of San Francisco is hiring a chief data services officer, if anyone's out there is interested. They think about that because to them, technology is a great equalizer. Yep. Making tools mobile first is a way that people who, especially low-income people who access the internet through their phone, can access the services they need. And that becomes, I think, a really important point. And I would say that you see this across governments on all levels, cities, counties, and of course, the federal government with 18F and USDS, that's the United States Digital Service. They are thinking very much about how to bring digital professionals into government. What also gives me excitement is that equity is not a dirty word anymore, even among the business community. I was just in San Diego yesterday, and before coming in CFA, I used to work at the Regional Economic Development Corporation there. And usually you don't think of economic development and equity as things that go hand in hand. I remember watching the new chair of EDC, who runs a major defense contractor, say his big priority is equity. And what stands out to me about that is that's business saying we have to be training people in our community because labor markets and employment markets are regional. We have to train people in our community to have the jobs we need them to be taking in the future, and some of them sooner than later. So we have to be investing in workforce development. We have to be investing in a number of those initiatives. And those are kind of the cross-sector things that I think really bring this work to life. What also, Code for America, we think about technology, and so we're seeing government, local government, and regional initiatives use technology to better do their work. And so I think one example is a partnership we have with Living Cities through something called the Civic Tech and Data Collaborative, where the city of Boston is making a new app to improve youth employment programs. And if you ask Boston, they would tell you, and they arguably do have one of the strongest youth employment programs in the country. But even with that, they can place less than half of the number of applicants who apply for jobs every year. And that's because these caseworkers have to spend a lot of their time doing the match, which is hard grunt work. But what they really need to be, they acknowledge they need more time, is more time sourcing jobs, more time helping the mayor be the chief evangelist for the summer jobs program and get employers to be putting jobs that youth can take and actually build skills and get into the world of work and stay out of trouble. And so the tool there started with making it easier to do the match and includes things like transportation and using an API to figure out, can someone get to where they're going to work every day, not just skills and interests. But we know one of the main reasons that people often fall out of their jobs is they can't get there on time every day because public transit isn't reliable enough. And so how can we use big data to understand like what would be a good match for them based not only on skills and interests, but their ease of getting to work. I think another example that's really bringing this to life, we were talking about this before, about criminal justice, is California passed Prop 47. So state did something really great. It passed a bill that allows people to clear their record, in which for people trying to get jobs, that's really important, especially if they have criminal activity on their record. But clearing your record is actually really difficult, and that the policy didn't invest in the technology to actually make it easier to do that. And in fact, for many people, the only way for them to clear their record is to like actually go into the public defender's office in the county where they have the offense. And if you think about what that means, that's a big deal, because for a lot of people, they don't want to go back there. They've moved on. It may be a decade or two since they had that offense on their record. And so for them, they just want to apply online, which, lo and behold, you can't do. Except for a few places that are working with Code for America, and they have a tool called Clear My Record. If you are on the city and county of San Francisco and you try to clear your record, Clear My Record is a tool that is the official tool that the county uses to do that. Contra Costa is doing the same thing. Alameda is about to come on board. And so I think to the point of where I'm seeing cities do this work, these are the same bureaucrats who think about they're just, filing paperwork, and now these are helping people get jobs, and that's really cool to see.
Amanda, maybe you can talk about the recent portal that you just launched, which I think is such a good example of a city being able to deliver on something that's important to small business people trying to actually build a company and income and wealth. But I think the speed in which you did it, the quality of it, maybe you can, even the principles that you use, I think are just so different and maybe a surprise to many of the people in the audience.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So in Los Angeles, more than 80% of our businesses have under 20 employees, which means that small business is a really important part of our economy. And it's an important part because that number is actually growing. And while we're trying to bring in certainly more large businesses, we recently had Snapchat and Google and a whole bunch of other folks come down and join us in Los Angeles. We are just very aware that Los Angeles really is small business. And for many years, the city has talked a lot about having a better way for small businesses to access the city, and even just understand how to set up a small business in Los Angeles, as well as even manage their business and arguably grow their business, and what that might look like in LA. We have 38 departments in Los Angeles. There's arguably more than 200 permits you might need if you're a small business. Not 100% sure if you do. There's probably more like 20 or 30, but who's going to tell you which, how, when, and which of those 38 departments you should go to figure any of that out? The answer is no one. And you may be walking around to building and safety, to planning, to whoever it is. And of course, if you're savvy and you have a great relationship with your council person, or for some reason you know me or our small business advocate, you have a much better chance at success. So to the themes of equity, right, of course, none of that is actually equitable. And so, what we recognized in the space of our work is that there really was an opportunity, and the city applied for a grant from the Small Business Administration in Los Angeles, got a grant to actually, not a huge grant, but a grant to do something. And what we were supposed to build was this Startup in a Day tool, which is a really incredible movement that Code for America is involved in and been instrumental and really influential in with the U.S. Small Business Administration, as well as several other folks. But what we wanted to do was actually more than just build the Startup in a Day tool. We wanted to build a portal because we recognize that in LA, with our numbers, as I've already mentioned, doing something great is essential. And so we built a portal, and so you can go online and look at that and see more about it for yourself. I view it as stage one in what really we need to be doing. There's probably 2 or 3 stages. And so we launched it Wednesday, and on Thursday we were already talking about what's next. Because we can't lose the momentum, of course. But we did it in procurement, as I'm sure you all know, can be really long in cities. And we were able to procure in about 2 months, and we were able to make an amazing case for why this was important. We had a grant. We said we have an amazing team of people here on the innovation team that are going to do this, and if you don't do it now, you're going to lose us. And so from the day we kicked it off, I think it was February 1st, to our beta, which went live on May 2nd, to our launch on September 14th. Which is quite aggressive, and I don't think anyone slept for 9 months. Actually, I can tell you that we didn't sleep. We've all been looking forward to September 15th. But I think it really speaks to what's possible. Right. And I think if there's nothing else that our colleagues in the city really appreciated it was, saying at the beginning, no, this isn't possible, and then in May they were like, oh, they're not joking, mm-hmm. and then in September they were all at the party, saying, wow, this happened, and what do we do next to make it better? And we really focus on sort of the concepts of user-centered design, which I don't know how much you all know about that, but I'll just briefly say that it's really, in our case, thinking of businesses as the folks that we're building this product for, not me, not anyone in government, other than the people that might be processing permits, right? We spend a lot of time with them. And the goal really is to build something that in what we're building reflects our users, and in what we're writing, it's written at a level where they can understand it. It isn't legalese, it isn't policy, it's English that tells people how to do the things they need to do. And we built it open source, which I would just share because we have a partnership. We really believe in giving things to everyone. And sharing. And so we worked with San Francisco, and we hope that all of you will go on what's called GitHub and give you a starting point with the idea that we paid for what we paid for, and you should now have to pay less. And so that gives other cities the chance to, you'll still have to do work, but hopefully less work than we had to do, and hopefully you'll get some sleep if you do it in 9 months, which is. But it's business.lacity.org, and it tells you how to get the code. It talks all about the partnerships, and at some point soon, it'll talk about what we want to do next, because I think that's also an important momentum is great.
So I want to open this up in a minute, but let me ask you something, if I can, Glenn, which is, you talked about the power of locality to locality. Talk a little bit more about that. You said you have this cohort of 5 cities, but you also work with other networks. Why does that matter, and what are you seeing about how that, and does it actually accelerate the pace of change?
It's a great question. I think it matters for several reasons, especially as we talk about equity. We were naming earlier that jurisdictions, cities, places have their own unique flavor, and yet many of them have the exact same challenges. So working on racial equity, it turns out that the outcomes in Seattle based on race are really close to the outcomes in Tuskegee, Alabama based on race. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we know across the country is that we're getting the same outcomes regardless of place. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, there's a huge opportunity for folks to actually really learn from each other, right? So strategies, especially around equity strategies that work in Seattle, actually tend to actually be fairly effective in Atlanta. And so I think in that way, there's a recognition that folks coming together really have the opportunity to learn from each other. And then to Amanda's point, there is this way in which, having sort of an open source approach, sort of peer-to-peer learning, just accelerates learning. People don't have to start from scratch, and they usually improve it. And I think what we see is that, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows this, policy, it's never one and done, right? There's never something that we get to, and there's not an opportunity to improve it, bring some additional heft to it, make it work better for folks. And so in that way, I think we definitely see across location, folks not only learning from each other, but building on each other's work in sort of tangible ways.
Yeah, so let me see if anybody in the audience has any questions for these folks. Yes?
I love the last comment about sharing, because this is probably one instance where what happens in Vegas shouldn't stay.
Correct, exactly.
And, if you guys could wave your magic wands, what would be the best way to institutionalize that sharing, or to make it happen so that the best ideas and solutions can scale more quickly?
I mean, I would just jump in and say that it's probably a 4-hour answer, I guess I would say. But I think what I would, in 30 seconds, say is that not being afraid to do that. I mean, I think what I've learned is that actually in governments against each other can be very competitive, but within cities, even departments can be competitive, right? Because for just like if it were Pepsi and Coke, right? It's sort of that same idea. But I think being able to have the conversation about the fact that we're sharing and then actually living that for us has really made the difference. And I think you can say it, but then actually doing it is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. And I know that that's true for us, at least on our team. You know, I know that when we partnered with San Francisco, and I think that they were sort of wondering if we really meant it, and we really meant it, right? We put them in our press release. I'm serious, I mean it, and I will put you in our stuff. And it makes you better if we do something like what we did in LA. We built something brand new, and so they can now take that back as San Francisco and add that, and that's great for me, right? Because then people in LA are getting served just like people in San Francisco. So in a sense, maybe it's the belief, but in another sense, it's actually really doing it and proving that you mean it, and going back and saying, we meant it and we did it, and what are we going to do next together? So some of it's the spirit, but some of it's, I think most of it's actually the doing. And the other thing I think that we get feedback on is having agendas, which is really weird and very micro and very practical. But we show up in every meeting with an agenda, which sounds bizarre that would be something that makes it different. And then at the end, we always talk about how we're going to share things and what's next. And I think that gives ownership and accountability to real people. And to me, that's been something that I think has pivoted our work, and people come back to partner with us for those reasons, I think.
I'd say another thing that, to the point about scale, specifically on the technology side, there's some really interesting partnerships happening between cities and their communities of developers who want to solve, engineers love solving big problems. And I'll say the engineers at Code for America certainly, engineers are all over the place fit that. And for many of them who may not do like the most, they love doing that outside of work too. And so Code for America has a program called the Brigades, and the Brigade Network has 50,000 people who've raised their hand and said, hey, I want to use technology and big data for good. And so we've seen a number of partnerships where cities and brigades have come together, and even city staff go to the brigades and lead the brigades, which actually is super cool. And they're non-tech people leading brigades, which is even better. And I think what we see there is, hey, let's scale a small tool. Let's just try something out. The price of failure is light because it's agile and it's small. And let's build that trust, and let's build our muscle to do that. And eventually we can start scaling bigger things like a business portal. So, Los Angeles is open source, which means the code is there, and anybody can download the code, put up new content, do some design features. And yes, that takes time, but you've got a starting point. And so I think that's something that we've seen on the tech side work really well.
Well, and we have seen, like your instinct, that we've seen that now for the last almost, 10 years, that there's this appetite for these cities. And I do think it is very different. Well, we've worked with states too, not the same culture. And for a lot of reasons. But at the city level, they actually want to work with each other, and they have this little co-opetition, or whatever the word is, where, right, because they actually want to help each other, but they want to do better. So San Francisco will want to build that portal that LA built better, but in a good way. And in fact, Amanda and her folks will actually help them build it better, so we actually, a fair amount of our work, like the 5 cities that we're working with Glenn and Garon, is bringing them together as cohorts, because they push each other and they compete. And when they come together like 6 months or a year, they don't want to have not made significant progress on their work when they go to their peers. And we have a network of 40 or so big cities that we do with the Kennedy School at Harvard, where every 6 months, these chiefs of staff to mayors, who are like the conduit to these different agencies, come and they share with each other. And the amount of work that they do outside of those meetings with each other is pretty extraordinary. And that's the momentum that we all can really take advantage of. That is very, very different. And they're willing to do really hard things like racial equity. When God talks about racial equity, it sounds like, oh yeah, it's a party and it's happy. It's impossible work. And when we did this competition for who wanted to compete to be in that 5-city cohort, we were kind of worried no one would apply. And we got a dozen of the 40 cities we invited to do it. So there really is a hunger for that.
That's
Here, first question here, then there.
Hi, my name is Chris Theodore. I publish a group of magazines in Southern California called The Reader. And we reach around 400,000 people, send it to everybody in the community. And one of the things that I hear you guys all trying to do essentially is raise political consciousness in each of your ways. You know, it gets to the granular level where you want to raise the political consciousness of a person, right? But the problem in using technology for that is that you run into the wall of the fact that a third of all Americans don't have broadband internet. So there is according to the FCC, about 2 or 3 years ago, so that's 120 million Americans. So where there is a lot of opportunity that I see is in local media, low-tech local media, because there are 4,000 communities across the United States of 30,000 households. Into each of those 30,000 households, there's $100 million spent on advertising. So you could be partnering with local media channels to raise political consciousness.
So let me ask, you guys try to do that at all? Or do you know any folks trying to do that?
I mean, I would say thank you for the question, because one thing I've been wanting to say is the storytelling aspect actually is something that I don't know that government often does well. And I think for me, I've realized it's maybe for a couple of reasons. One is because perhaps the media is really just interested in telling stories about, and I don't mean generally the media, but you know, local media perhaps often talks a lot about political figures versus the work that's getting done. And I think that's actually it's interesting. There's a lot of inspiring things happening in cities that I think we'd all be really excited if those stories got told and if the public actually knew how much work was going on for them on their behalf by great people. So I think that we don't always do the best job as government in telling our stories, and we know that, but we're so focused on the work. And then perhaps there's just maybe other things that get focused on rather than.
And that's where some of that opportunity is, because people are tired of the non-substantive stuff. You know, there's a total cultural shift.
I'm sure then you'd find a lot of people in LA that want you to tell our story, and probably some of like San Diego, I would imagine, Southern California. There's great stories to tell, particularly with all the change that's happening. And I mean, our business portal, we had a big launch party. We had 400 people there, but we have 4 million residents that live in LA. Right. We have 80% of our businesses have under 20, right? So that's a fraction. So how do we amplify that message? I mean, I moved on the next day to thinking about what's next. I wasn't necessarily focused on calling the media and saying, but I really want them to tell the story because I can't get what I want, which is users. So we rely on it, but to me, it's a question of what do we do next, right? So.
Let me go over here.
Hi, I'm Katie Baruzzi, and I work at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, and I oversee the development of our social innovation curriculum. So we work with a lot of students who don't intend to go into government. Most of them will take leadership roles in companies of various sizes, including places like Google and Facebook. One of the things I'm really interested in right now is understanding more about the kind of partnerships that you might have had with larger companies, beyond corporate philanthropy and beyond individual corporate volunteerism. Are there examples that you have of a company really making a significant impact positively in, against gentrification or working on housing, transportation policies, et cetera?
Anybody want to answer that? I think the silence may be instructive.
I would say it depends on what scale you mean by that, right? So I know in many jurisdictions around the country, Seattle, Twin Cities did an amazing job of pulling in local business and some of the big players, right? They have more Fortune 500 companies located there, right?
25 Fortune 500 companies.
To really talk about sort of race and equity. And one of the projects that they did, it actually ties back to your comment, was they did this citywide book project together. It was around this idea of One Minneapolis, bringing in an author and a book that was really focused on issues of race and equity. And then they actually had book clubs that brought in like 50 of the sort of major corporations and tied it then not only in a more interesting way to their own internal sort of diversity efforts within the businesses, All of that then culminated in a gathering in which they brought the author, and they had like 2,000 people from the city come together to have then a conversation about what they had learned from the book and what it meant for their work. So I think there's places where we see that, and I think on a smaller scale, more tangible things like, you know, developers who have really stepped in and said, I'm committed to sort of bringing in an equity focus to this particular development. But on that bigger scale, more sort of broad sort of questions of education, which have their own value. They do.
I could just add for LA, you know, in this last year, we have 3, I think, really great partnerships. One has been with actually my former employer, Deloitte Consulting, and they've done a lot of really cool work with me, in part because I've gone and said, you have to, and please, because I worked there for a really long time. But they're doing a lot with us around training, and so training our staff actually in the city, and helping, you know, on a quarterly basis, really bring folks that are focused on change management in government, really tactical things like project management, change management, that sort of thing. Citibank actually has approached us about doing some work actually in African American communities based on one of our other programs around businesses. So they're very interested in scaling our program actually, and I think that's because it showed results. And to me, that's actually the thing in every one of our projects. I want to be able to say, because in the private sector, to some extent, that's very much what matters, right? And so how do you show what the results are? In the case of Citibank, they see the results and they actually reached out to us and want to fund. And then we have a collaborative of partnerships on a third project that we have going, which I think has been really interesting for folks, because there's some private sector, but then there's actually community organizations. And so that working together has been really interesting, I think, for all of them. They've learned quite a bit from that. That's a housing thing that we're doing.
So my pause should not be taken that there's any shortage of examples where corporations are thinking about kind of the shared value opportunities. I'd say one thing to your question, I think also relates to this, is investigative journalism, well-done investigative journalism remains one of the great ways to move change forward, whether that's for government or for companies. And I would just, I think to the point of using how we leverage local media, and especially print journalism, that remains something that I think a lot about. And now across a variety of companies, I've seen a lot of really good things. So one, companies are not thinking about their youth summer jobs programs just as corporate philanthropy. They need to have a workforce of the future. So when Salesforce hires a bunch of diverse engineers, it's because they're thinking about diversity. The future of our population is changing. The engineers of the future are going to look very different than the engineers of today. And let's be real, a lot of the tech companies, they're really good at hiring white guys. And that's not what the future engineer is going to be. And so how do we really think about that? I was at a panel with the head of diversity and inclusion for Yelp, and she was saying that she left Yelp pre-IPO, only to come back post-IPO, which cost her a lot of money. But the reason she brought that up is she's like, I didn't feel included there. Right. And I didn't feel welcome there. And so that's something that companies have to think a lot about, especially if they think about what the future of their workforce needs are going to be. I think that there is also something that around understanding needs. And so another really good example of that is Qualcomm has something called the Think a Bit Lab, which is like a whole lab to learn robotics mostly for middle school girls, which is really a key moment where people determine, kids determine what they want to do with themselves, and they determine what's cool and what's not, and what they should play with and what they shouldn't. And the Think a Bit Lab is a really good opportunity to engage folks in robotics and the tools that are in coding and basic skills that are going to ultimately be the skills that are going to matter for them getting the jobs they want in the future.
So, and my experience has been that when you are able to help the companies bring what they do well to the solution, to the problem, they are much better at doing at partnering. And there was a group, I think they may have been here in the last few days, but they started in Chicago, the Civic Consulting Alliance, and now they're around the country. But that's what they do, basically. They marry companies. So if you're a city and you have 10,000 trucks, when you look at, public works and police and all of that, you want a company that knows how to actually manage fleets. And so they get a company that manages, their business is managing fleets to come, provide that pro bono to the city. That kind of stuff is incredibly effective, and they have amazing stories of that success. We helped to create a network of now 66 cities that are taking on education from cradle to career. It's called the Strive Together Network. And it started in Cincinnati, and they wanted to make the education work be much more results-oriented, use data. And so they took their Six Sigma black belts, which is continuous improvement, and they created a Six Sigma Light, and they trained all of the people who are involved in education from cradle to career to use Six Sigma. That kind of thing we have found much more successful because they're going with their strength as opposed to building something that they just are not going to use again. It's been our experience.
I want to just build on that because I think there's something else that we see a lot at Code for America, which is a lot of big tech companies aren't used to building technology the way technology should be built today.
It's true. It's not necessarily proprietary. It's part of the challenge.
They are not used to the developer community acting in the ways that it does. So the civic tech community has some specific needs that other developer communities may not. The community that builds in Agile may have needs that the other rest of the developer community or these companies are not used to serving. And so I think a really good example of this is Case Commons, which is a Agile software development company, won a contract from the state of California. And it's huge. Now, for most people, like, oh my gosh, a company won a bid. Huge news because it didn't go to the other companies that usually win big state contracts. And the state contract was written differently in the first place to encourage and require Agile software development. Now, what's happening is the companies are realizing we have to change our practices. And so what we're also seeing is, this is not philanthropy, this is the biz dev team saying, I need to change how we build technology because government and our customers are thinking differently. Because now there's other companies that are coming into the space.
Yeah, I mean, just the changes in procurement that are happening in the public sector, we could spend hours on because it's actually extraordinary and nobody would know it. It's a big deal. We have about, yes, sir.
Hi, I get that the city is our level of analysis. I happen to live here in San Francisco, and in San Francisco we don't have an air quality problem because the prevailing winds go east. And I'd like to hear just a word about sort of the toolbox for and ways to incentivize in cases where cities really aren't thinking about how they externalize certain aspects of what they do onto the neighboring city or the surrounding community. What is the toolbox, or is there one that's emerging to help us think more regionally rather than sort of as little city-states next to each other that jostle for various things? We could talk about transportation, pick your thing, but that tapestry kind of notion of how cities and their surrounding areas fit together and how that toolbox is being developed for thinking more deeply and richly about it.
Absolutely. Anybody want to take that on? It's a really exciting area of work.
Yeah, I'll just say that one of the things that we spent increasing amount of time on is really looking at metros and working with the metropolitan planning organizations and regions. They are frequently anemic in a way that they really need to be much more robust. Most places you go into, people don't even know what their metro planning organization is, right? But really, to your point, there's a deep need, especially as we think about climate change, as we think about transportation, as we think about growth and development, and as we think about fundamentally issues of equity. That is a regional question. It has to be. And so I think there's a growing amount of interest in really thinking through those issues. And I deeply believe that breaking the silos, going back to Amanda and Ephraim's point, that breaking the silos internally to local government creates more space for folks to have a deeper conversation about breaking those silos across city locales. So.
I think the only thing I might add to that is that I think it comes in some senses to a leadership question, and leadership of mayors and leadership of city councils and leadership of all of the folks, right? So I think as we all go out to vote, we should be looking for people who want to see that happen and also know how to operationalize that. On the West Coast, I think homelessness actually is a great example. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle are all seeing very similar things to what I was sharing before. And so in this past year, we've seen those city leaders come together to actually have a conversation about what does it mean, right? Because it may be that people are moving from Seattle to Portland to San Francisco to LA. It's a very logical progression, right? The weather, all of that. Sure. So I think there's some really great examples. And I think the only other thing I might add is organizations like Living Cities and like Bloomberg Philanthropies, like Rockefeller. I think they're also convening, like Harvard Kennedy School, they're convening leaders from these cities to try to bring them together, again, back to the idea of problem solving. And we see some of the climate action things happening, and leadership on that, I think, as far as leading, not even just nationally, but globally. But I think it's a suite of things, but certainly it's a question of our leaders and how they're going to really solve our problems together, right?
This is like a really tough question, and I think having spent time in San Diego and now San Francisco, where housing and transportation may remain major issues, in part because local jurisdictional boundaries don't match up with employment boundaries, is a big problem. The question I think about, what's the right mix of carrots and sticks you want to use to encourage and incentivize or disincentivize, like the focus on like the individual needs of your one city or town. There's like 100 small towns in the Bay Area, small towns and big cities with own unique needs, who want BART or don't want BART, and who don't want want more housing, don't want more housing, want more jobs, don't want more jobs. And I think it's really hard to think about a regional perspective with that in mind. And so I think you need some type of regional governance structure, whether that's through things like MPOs and that can offer the right mix of regulation and incentives to hopefully move local governments to do that work. We know, there's examples of cities trying to neighborhood groups wanting to have regulatory power for planning at the neighborhood level. We know that ultimately doesn't accomplish the goal of doing what we want to do in terms of getting additional housing built or thinking more about those equity issues. So it's something that regionalism is something we've been, at least I think, a lot about.
Yeah. One more question, if anybody has one. Why don't we just go right here, close to me?
Can you speak about climate change and innovation being deployed to tackle that at the city level?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, Los Angeles, I think, is doing, I can speak to LA, and I can say that our mayor has taken that up as one of his top priorities. He has an Office of Sustainability that is led by actually one of the world's leaders in climate change and sustainability, just as a practice. And so we're doing a lot of really incredible things in LA, like making City Hall, turning the temperature up in City Hall and in all government offices, and then actually inspiring all of our residents to do the same through what you don't often see government do, but through some pretty impactful marketing campaigns. So they've done a beautiful job of really threading the idea of, in this case, how to turn the temperature up into a marketing campaign and bringing it into people's homes through bills from energy companies and so forth. So I think that's just a very small example of action happening. But then I think at the global level, LA is also trying to drive along with former Mayor Bloomberg and really, so I forget how many mayors it is, but there's a huge compact of mayors that have signed, and even Governor Brown this last week, I think, signed some pretty impactful legislation around climate change. So I think you actually see leaders coming together around that topic. Obviously, there's a very long way to go, and we're not totally sure exactly what it all means, right? But I think it's a nice example in the world of examples of being able to work, not even just on a regional level, although I guess I might wonder how effective it is regionally. I know what we're doing in LA, but we have 88 cities, right, in LA County. Are we all working together? I'm not sure that we really are, but do we want to? I think we really do. So it's a question of how we take it and amplify it regionally and then globally.
All right, you have 24 seconds to get your last comment in if you want it.
Okay, well, I'll just say, San Diego, I think, is the largest city in the country that's taken an 100% renewable pledge that 100% of its energy is going to come from renewable sources. So it's thinking about really two things. One, green jobs and who gets those green jobs, and that's a really good opportunity. And two is really focused on transit-oriented development, that if it's going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to focus on putting people in the right places.
And Boulder, Colorado is doing a lot of cool stuff around some of those topics too, if you're looking for great examples.
Urban Sustainability Directors Network. If check out their website. There are amazing projects going on across the country around climate change and increasingly centering issues of race and equity.
And a great example of these cities wanting to work together. It's at least 10 years old, that network,
That's right.
and it gets better and better as it goes on. I want to thank the panelists for joining this discussion.